That is not a real service dog. Look at it. It's not even wearing a proper vest. I'd heard some version of that sentence more times in my life than I could possibly count, but there was something about the tone this time, sharp, performative, pitched deliberately loud enough for the whole gate area to hear, that told me this particular encounter wasn't going to be a quick, forgettable one. My guide dog, Baxter, a steady, unshakable black lab who's walked me through airports on 3 continents, didn't so much as flinch. He sat exactly where he was trained to sit, harness secure, completely unbothered by the accusation being hurled at us both from a few feet away. He's wearing his harness, I said, keeping my voice level. That's the working gear he's trained in. That doesn't prove anything. Anyone can buy a vest online. I've read all about people faking this to bring pets on planes for free. I felt Baxter shift his weight slightly against my leg, not agitated, just present, the way he always is when he senses I might need him a little closer. I had absolutely no idea, in that moment, just how badly this woman was about to embarrass herself in front of an entire gate full of strangers. Hey, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm legally blind, I travel with my guide dog Baxter constantly, and over the years, I've developed a very specific radar for the kind of person who's about to make my trip through an airport a whole lot more complicated than it needs to be. Today's story is about a woman I'm calling HOA Karen, because, right on schedule, she brought up her homeowners association credentials within the first 15 minutes, apparently convinced that experience enforcing mailbox regulations somehow qualified her to determine which service animals are legitimate. This is a story about a fake accusation, some genuinely bizarre missing item chaos, a very patient gate agent, a public confrontation that had an entire gate area holding its breath, and an ending that involved this woman getting denied boarding entirely, not because of my dog, but because of something she'd been hiding the whole time. If you love airport chaos and karma stories, this is exactly your kind of video. Stick around, and if you enjoy it, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Let me back up, because I want you to understand exactly how normal this trip felt right up until it wasn't. I was flying out for a work conference, something I do a handful of times a year, and honestly, by this point in my life, traveling with Baxter is about as smooth a process as anything I do. He's been my working partner for almost 5 years now, trained meticulously, recertified regularly, and about as steady and professional a coworker as I could ever ask for. I'd gotten to the airport with plenty of time, checked in without issue, and made my way to the gate the way I always do, Baxter guiding me confidently through the terminal, weaving around luggage and people with the kind of practiced precision that still amazes me even after all these years of working together. The gate area, when we arrived, had that familiar low hum of pre-boarding activity, announcements, the occasional beep of a scanner, quiet conversations blending into background noise. I found a seat near the gate, settled Baxter down beside me with his usual quiet efficiency, and pulled out my phone to catch up on a podcast while we waited for boarding to start. Nothing about that moment suggested anything unusual was coming. If anything, it felt like one of the easier travel days I'd had in a while, smooth check-in, no delays on the board, plenty of time before boarding. I had absolutely no idea that within 20 minutes, I was going to be standing at the center of one of the most public, most absurd confrontations of my entire travel history. I remember settling into that chair, letting Baxter arrange himself comfortably against my feet, and doing what I usually do while waiting to board, listening. It's a habit I picked up years ago, long before Baxter came into my life, a way of building a mental map of the space around me through sound alone. The clatter of rolling luggage wheels on tile. A toddler somewhere nearby negotiating loudly with a parent about snacks. The rhythmic announcements calling other flights, other gates, other people's journeys unfolding around mine. It's a strangely peaceful way to experience an airport, honestly, once you get used to it. There's a rhythm to it, a predictability, even in a place built entirely around chaos and constant movement. I could tell, just from the ambient noise, that this particular gate area was fuller than usual, more voices layered over each other than I typically hear at this time of day. I remember thinking, idly, that it was probably a fairly full flight, and settling in for what I expected to be a routine, uneventful wait, the kind I've experienced hundreds of times before without a second thought. I first noticed her, or rather, heard her, about 10 minutes after settling in. She'd arrived at the gate loudly complaining to a gate agent about her seat assignment, insisting she'd always been upgraded on this route before and couldn't understand why the system was suddenly failing her. Let's call her Deborah. I couldn't see her, obviously, but based on everything I picked up through sound and secondhand description from a nearby passenger later, she was the type who dressed like every trip was a formal occasion, spoke to airline staff like they worked for her personally, and apparently mentioned, unprompted, within her very first exchange with the gate agent, that she ran her community's homeowners association, and knew exactly how systems were supposed to function when people did their jobs properly. After failing to secure her upgrade, Deborah seemed to be scanning the gate area for a new target, and unfortunately, Baxter and I were sitting right in her line of sight. I heard her footsteps approach, deliberate and unhurried, stopping directly in front of us. "Excuse me," she said, not particularly excusing herself for anything. "Is that dog actually necessary, or is this one of those situations where people fake a disability to bring their pet along?" I felt my whole body go still in that particular way it does when I know, immediately, that I'm about to have to defend something deeply personal to a complete stranger who's already decided what she thinks. It's an exhausting kind of familiarity, if I'm being honest. Most people who ask about Baxter do so with genuine curiosity, and I never mind those conversations. I actually enjoy talking about him, about the years of training that go into a working guide dog, about how much independence he's given me. But there's a specific tone certain people use, one that isn't really a question at all, just an accusation dressed up as one, and I'd learned to recognize it almost instantly, usually within the first few words. Deborah's tone had that unmistakable edge from the very first sentence, and I remember feeling my shoulders tense slightly, bracing myself for a conversation I already knew wasn't going to be resolved with a simple, polite explanation. "He's my guide dog," I said, keeping my tone even despite the tight, familiar frustration building in my chest. "I'm visually impaired. He's trained to help me navigate." "You don't look blind," Deborah said, and I heard the faint scoff underneath the words, the kind of comment I've unfortunately grown used to over the years but never quite gotten used to hearing without a flash of anger. "Vision impairment doesn't always look the way people expect," I said. "But he's certified, and under the law, I'm not required to prove that to you." "Well, I have a right to know if I'm sitting near a legitimate service animal or just someone's pet dressed up in a costume," Deborah said, raising her voice slightly, clearly hoping to draw attention to the exchange. "I've read all about people abusing this system, and frankly, I think it's disrespectful to people who actually need these accommodations." "I do actually need this accommodation," I said, feeling Baxter press a little closer against my leg, sensing the tension in my voice even before I fully registered it myself. "That's what everyone says," Deborah replied. "I want to speak to a gate agent about this. I don't feel safe boarding a flight where I can't verify what's really going on." She stalked off toward the desk, and I sat there for a moment, jaw tight, one hand resting on Baxter's steady, warm back, trying to remind myself that this wasn't going to be the first or last time I had to have this exact argument with a stranger who decided, within 30 seconds, that they knew my life better than I did. For a while after that, things seemed to settle. I could hear, from a distance, the gate agent explaining calmly to Deborah that service animals were permitted without requiring documentation under the relevant regulations, and that there was nothing irregular about my traveling with Baxter. Deborah returned to her seat, apparently unsatisfied, and things went quiet for a few minutes. Then, strange things started happening. I reached down for my cane, which I always keep folded beside me even when Baxter's working, purely as backup, and found it wasn't where I'd left it. I patted around calmly, years of practice have made me pretty good at not panicking over small disruptions, and asked the woman seated near me if she'd seen it. She hadn't, but she offered to help me look, and a minute or two later, found it several seats away, tucked behind a support pillar in a spot that made no sense given how carefully I'd set it beside me. Then my boarding documentation, a printed copy I keep as a courtesy even though it's not legally required, went missing from the outer pocket of my bag. And oddest of all, Baxter's spare leash, the backup I carry in case his primary one ever fails, vanished from where it was clipped to my bag entirely. None of it seemed connected to me at first, mostly because I couldn't see anything happening around me to explain it. But the woman who'd helped me find my cane mentioned, quietly, that she'd noticed Deborah walking past our row twice in that same window, each time slowing down noticeably as she passed. I don't want to accuse anyone without being sure, the woman said carefully. But it seemed odd. It seemed odd to me too. I flagged down a passing airline employee and explained what had happened, the missing cane, the missing documentation, the missing leash, and the pattern the nearby passenger had described. The employee took it seriously right away, especially once she understood that a missing cane wasn't just an inconvenience for me, but something that genuinely affected my ability to move safely if Baxter ever needed a break from working. She radioed for a gate supervisor, who arrived within a few minutes and began asking nearby passengers what they'd observed. Several people, it turned out, had noticed the same thing, Deborah making repeated, unnecessary trips past our row, each time lingering just a little too long near my belongings. The supervisor mentioned that the gate area, like most parts of the terminal, was covered by security cameras, and pulled up footage on a handheld device to review the timeline in question. It didn't take long to find exactly what everyone had already started to suspect. The footage showed Deborah, during one of her walks past our row, reaching down and sliding my cane behind the support pillar. A separate clip showed her lifting my printed documentation from my bag's outer pocket during a second pass, tucking it quickly into her own tote. And a third, brief clip showed her unclipping Baxter's spare leash and slipping it into the same bag, barely breaking stride as she did it. "Ma'am," the supervisor said, walking over to where Deborah was seated, "we have you on camera taking several items from this passenger's belongings." I couldn't see Deborah's face, but based on the sudden shift in her voice, I could hear exactly the kind of expression she was probably wearing, that mixture of panic and indignation I'd already started to expect from people like her. "That's absolutely absurd," she said. "I haven't touched anyone's belongings. I don't know what you're talking about." "We have clear footage, ma'am, from 3 separate moments over the last 20 minutes, the supervisor replied, unmoved. "I'll need you to open your bag." "This is a gross invasion of privacy," Deborah said, her voice climbing. "I have rights as a passenger." "You do," the supervisor said. "And this passenger has a right to his belongings, particularly his cane, which is a mobility aid, not a casual accessory." There was a pause, and I heard the distinct sound of a zipper, followed by a small, collective intake of breath from the people nearby. My cane, my documentation, and Baxter's spare leash were all recovered from Deborah's tote bag, exactly where the footage had shown her put them. "I was going to return those," Deborah said, her voice noticeably smaller now. I was concerned about the legitimacy of the situation, and I wanted to hold on to them until I got clarity." "You took a blind man's cane," the woman who'd helped me find it earlier said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "While accusing him of faking a disability." The gate area, which had been quietly listening to the entire exchange, erupted into a low murmur of disbelief. "This is completely blown out of proportion," Deborah announced, apparently deciding her best move was to go on the offensive. "I was simply trying to verify a suspicious situation, and now I'm being treated like a criminal over a misunderstanding." "You hid my cane behind a pillar," I said, finally speaking directly to her for the first time since the confrontation had escalated. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's deliberately sabotaging my ability to move safely through this airport. I run my community's homeowners association," Deborah said, apparently reaching once again for the one credential she seemed to believe carried universal weight. "I know how to handle situations involving rule violations." "This isn't your neighborhood, ma'am," the supervisor said evenly, and I heard at least 4 or 5 people nearby actually laugh out loud at that. "She's been accusing this man's service dog of being fake this entire time," the woman beside me added, loud enough for the whole area to hear now. "And she's the one who turned out to be lying." Baxter, sensing the tension around us, leaned his full weight gently against my leg, a small, grounding gesture he does automatically whenever things get overwhelming, something I've come to rely on more than I probably even fully realize most days. "I want everyone to understand," Deborah said, her voice rising to reach the widest possible audience, "that I was simply looking out for the safety and integrity of this flight." By stealing from a blind passenger, someone called out from a few rows back, and the murmur of agreement that followed made it clear the crowd had made up its mind a while ago. Cornered and clearly humiliated, Deborah didn't back down. If anything, she pushed harder, insisting she was being unfairly targeted and demanding to speak to airline corporate leadership immediately. "I want this documented as harassment," she said. "I am a loyal, frequent customer of this airline, and I will not be treated this way. Ma'am, given the circumstances, we're actually going to need to verify your travel documentation as well," the supervisor said, something in his tone shifting slightly, more focused now. "Can I see your boarding pass and any documentation for the small dog I noticed in your bag earlier?" The gate area went quiet again, because, and I hadn't even known this detail until that exact moment, apparently Deborah had a small dog of her own tucked into a carrier bag she'd been keeping close to her the entire time. One she'd claimed, when boarding began, was an emotional support animal exempt from standard pet fees. Deborah hesitated, just a beat too long. "That's a separate matter. Given everything else we've just discovered, I don't think it is," the supervisor said, holding out his hand for the documentation. Reluctantly, Deborah produced a printed certificate, official looking at a glance but, on closer inspection by the supervisor, containing several formatting inconsistencies and a certification number that, when checked against the airline system, came back completely invalid. "Ma'am, this certification doesn't match any valid registry in our system," the supervisor said, his voice calm but unmistakably serious now. Presenting fraudulent documentation to avoid airline pet fees is a significant issue, separate entirely from what's already happened here today. "I printed that off a legitimate website," Deborah said, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of everything stacking up against her. "I didn't know it wasn't valid. Given the combination of factors here, the theft of another passenger's mobility aid and documentation, the false accusations made against a legitimate service animal, and now fraudulent documentation presented for your own animal, I'm going to have to deny you boarding for this flight," the supervisor said. "You cannot be serious," Deborah said, her voice rising in a way that had lost all its earlier confidence, replaced now with something closer to genuine panic. "I have a connection to catch. This is discrimination." "This is fraud, ma'am," the supervisor replied simply. "And theft. Airport security will need to speak with you further before you're permitted to reschedule any future travel with us." 2 airport security officers arrived within a few minutes, and I heard Deborah's protests grow quieter and quieter as she was escorted away from the gate, her earlier bravado completely gone. Baxter, beside me, let out a small, satisfied huff, as if he understood exactly what had just happened, though I suspect that was more my own relief projecting onto him than anything he actually grasped. Once the commotion settled, several passengers came over to check on me, a few of them apologizing on Deborah's behalf, which honestly touched me more than I expected. The woman who'd helped me find my cane in the first place introduced herself properly, and we ended up chatting easily for the rest of the wait, trading stories about travel mishaps until boarding finally began. A gate agent asked if I'd be willing to give a brief statement for the incident report, which I gladly did, and thanked her for how seriously the whole situation had been handled from the moment it was flagged. She apologized on behalf of the airline for what I'd gone through, though I made a point of telling her that the staff themselves had handled everything about as well as anyone could have asked. Boarding, once it started, went smoothly, Baxter guiding me down the jet bridge with his usual calm confidence, completely unbothered by everything that had just happened around him. Several passengers I hadn't even spoken to during the confrontation stopped briefly to wish me a good flight as we boarded, small, kind gestures that meant more to me that day than they probably realized. I told a shortened version of the story to a colleague once I landed, mostly because I was still slightly stunned by how quickly the whole thing had unfolded, and by the time I got to the part about the fake service animal certification, she was laughing so hard she had to ask me to repeat it. What stays with me most about this whole experience isn't really the theft, or even the fraud that eventually got exposed. It's the fact that Deborah spent the entire encounter so convinced of her own righteousness, so certain that questioning my disability, and by extension my dignity, was some kind of public service, that she never once stopped to consider whether she had any actual standing to make that judgment in the first place. Service animals aren't a courtesy people extend out of politeness. They're a legal right, hard-won and necessary, for people who genuinely depend on them. Treating that right as something suspicious, something to be interrogated and second-guessed by strangers, does real harm, even when it doesn't end in someone's cane getting hidden behind a pillar. The lesson here, I think, goes beyond just this one story. It's about the assumptions people make when they decide, without any real information, that they understand someone else's life better than that person does. Deborah assumed I was lying about my disability. It turned out she was the one lying the entire time, and karma, as it so often does in these situations, caught up with her a lot faster than she ever expected. So here's my question for you: if you'd been sitting near us that day and overheard someone accusing a stranger's guide dog of being fake, would you have spoken up in the moment the way several passengers did, or waited to see how it played out first? Let me know in the comments, and if you've ever witnessed someone question a service animal's legitimacy in public, I'd genuinely love to hear how that situation unfolded. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you're subscribed, because trust me, Deborah was not the last Karen Baxter and I have encountered while traveling, and she definitely won't be the last one on this channel. Thanks for sticking with this story all the way through. I know it runs long, but every detail genuinely matters when you're trying to understand exactly how something this frustrating, and honestly this satisfying, plays out from start to finish. If you want more real airport stories like this one, you're in exactly the right place. See you in the next video.